The moment the alien commander called humanity weak, the entire arena stopped being safe. Coalition Stadium 7 could hold nearly 80,000 soldiers beneath its massive titanium gravity dome, and every seat was filled that night. Rows of armored alien cadets stood shoulder to shoulder beneath cold blue floodlights, while military banners drifted slowly through recycled air currents high above the arena floor. The smell of heated metal, engine fuel, and ozone hung thick across the enormous chamber. At the center of it all stood Commander Lyra Vane beside a 60-ton armored gravity tank resting on reinforced black steel. Even among the Coalition elite, she looked intimidating. Her blue skin carried faint, glowing markings beneath the stadium lights, while her pale cyan eyes reflected across polished armor plating surrounding the arena. Every movement felt controlled, deliberate, like gravity itself respected her rank. The announcer's amplified voice thundered across the stadium. Commander Lyra Vane of the Coalition 5th Fleet. The crowd erupted instantly. Alien soldiers slammed armored fists against their chests while cadets shouted her name from the upper decks. Lyra barely reacted. She simply stepped beside the massive gravity tank and placed one elegant blue hand beneath the front armor plate. Hydraulic systems hissed softly around the machine. Then slowly, without visible effort, she lifted the entire front half of the armored vehicle off the ground. The arena exploded with cheers loud enough to shake the steel flooring beneath the crowd. Several cadets pointed upward in excitement, while holographic cameras zoomed close on the impossible display of strength. The gravity tank weighed more than most civilian transport ships on Earth. Lyra held it with one hand. Then her glowing eyes shifted toward a lone human standing near the maintenance gate at the edge of the arena floor. Mason Hale wore no armor. No military insignia. Just an old gray maintenance jacket stained with engine grease, heavy work boots, and a rusted metal toolbox hanging loosely from one hand. He had arrived 15 minutes earlier to repair one of the arena cooling systems after another Coalition engineer refused to crawl beneath the overloaded pipe network. Mason looked tired more than anything else. 43 years old. Slightly unshaven. Brown hair messy from hours spent inside ventilation shafts. He looked completely out of place beneath the massive military lights surrounding him. Lyra lowered the gravity tank back onto the steel floor with a thunderous metallic impact before finally speaking toward him. "You look weak, Earthling." The entire arena laughed instantly. Even the upper observation decks joined in. Several cadets openly pointed toward Mason, while one alien officer nearly dropped his helmet laughing. Mason looked around slowly as if checking whether someone else had entered behind him. Then he quietly set his toolbox down beside the maintenance hatch. "Honestly," he answered calmly, "you should see me before coffee." More laughter rolled through the stadium. Lyra studied him carefully now. Most species became defensive when challenged publicly. Humans, according to Coalition intelligence reports, were emotional and pride-driven. But this one simply looked tired. Mason opened the maintenance panel near the arena wall and reached inside a cluster of overheated coolant lines while the military demonstration continued behind him. Hydraulic systems roared. Cadets cheered. Heavy armored vehicles rolled across the arena floor beneath flashing holographic scoreboards. Mason ignored all of it. His rough hands worked quietly through the damaged machinery, while sparks occasionally reflected across his face. One young alien cadet walked past him carrying a gravity-stabilized ammunition crate requiring 2 soldiers by coalition safety standards. The cadet smirked while struggling beneath the weight. "Careful, human," he mocked. "Would not want your tiny earth muscles snapping." Mason glanced briefly at the crate. "That thing looks loose on the left stabilizer." "What?" 3 seconds later, the stabilizer failed. The crate dropped violently against the steel floor with a deafening metallic crash, while ammunition canisters scattered across the arena walkway. Several nearby cadets jumped backward in shock. Mason sighed softly and tightened another coolant valve without looking up. "Told you." Somewhere high above the arena, Commander Lyra Vane stopped watching the military demonstration entirely. Her glowing pale blue eyes remained fixed on the quiet human mechanic kneeling beside the maintenance hatch, while 80,000 soldiers continued laughing around him. The military demonstration ended nearly an hour later, but Mason Hale was still working beneath the arena floor long after the crowds began leaving Coalition Stadium 7. The enormous gravity dome above him continued humming softly through layers of steel support beams, while thousands of departing soldiers marched through upper corridors overhead. Their heavy footsteps echoed constantly through the maintenance tunnels like distant thunder rolling across metal skies. Down below, the air smelled different. Hot coolant. Dust. Burned wiring insulation. Real work smells. Mason preferred those. He sat cross-legged beside an exposed cooling manifold beneath the western side of the arena, while a portable utility lamp cast pale white light across old tools scattered around him. His gray maintenance jacket hung open now from the heat, revealing faded Earth Shipping Company patches sewn into the fabric years earlier. One sleeve had been repaired so many times the stitching barely matched anymore. He looked more like an exhausted truck mechanic than a man standing inside one of the most advanced military facilities in Coalition space. Which was exactly why most aliens ignored him. A small portable radio near his toolbox quietly played old Earth jazz through static-filled speakers while Mason tightened pressure seals along the coolant lines above his head. Metal groaned softly around him every few minutes as the giant stadium slowly powered down for the night cycle. Somewhere farther down the tunnel, steam hissed from damaged ventilation valves. Mason glanced toward the sound automatically. "Yeah," he muttered under his breath. "You are next." A pair of Coalition cadets suddenly appeared at the far end of the maintenance corridor, carrying another gravity-stabilized ammunition crate between them. They stopped almost immediately after noticing the human beneath the utility light. One of them laughed quietly. Earthling still hiding underground. Mason kept tightening bolts without looking up. Pipes usually work better when they are attached. The second cadet shifted the heavy crate higher against his shoulder harness and smirked. Humans always talk strange. Humans also tighten our stabilizers correctly. The cadets frowned at each other. Mason finally pointed one grease-stained wrench toward the crate they carried. "Rear magnetic brace is drifting left again." "Impossible," the first cadet answered instantly. "Coalition equipment does not drift." Mason shrugged calmly. "Okay." They started walking again. 4 steps later, the rear stabilizer snapped loose with a loud metallic crack. The entire ammunition crate tilted sideways hard enough to slam against the tunnel wall before both cadets barely managed to stop it from collapsing completely. Warning lights flashed briefly across the damaged stabilizer housing. Mason slowly returned to tightening coolant valves. That usually happens around the 3rd pressure cycle, he said casually. Neither cadet laughed this time. One stared silently toward the human mechanic while the other adjusted the damaged brace with visible embarrassment. How did you know that? Mason wiped grease from his fingers using an old shop rag. Because your engineers mounted the stabilizer backwards. You saw that from 20 feet away? Heard it. The cadets exchanged another confused look before continuing deeper into the tunnel. Mason listened quietly to their footsteps fade away beneath the distant hum of machinery overhead. Then he returned to work without another word. Hours passed that way. Quiet repairs beneath a sleeping military station. The utility lamp reflected softly across worn tools while old jazz drifted through static-filled radio speakers beside him. Somewhere above the tunnel network, enormous armored transport vehicles rolled slowly back toward Coalition hangars after the demonstration. Every vibration moved through the steel walls around Mason like the heartbeat of some giant mechanical animal. Then suddenly the radio signal cut into sharp static. Emergency frequency override. Mason immediately looked up from the coolant manifold. A distorted voice crackled through the speaker. Attention, all maintenance personnel. Reactor fluctuations detected inside Arena Vehicle Bay 3. Mason sighed tiredly and reached for his toolbox. Of course it is Vehicle Bay 3. He shut off the utility lamp and started walking through the dark tunnel toward the upper maintenance lifts while steam drifted slowly across the corridor floor around his boots. Far above him, inside the private observation deck overlooking the military complex, Commander Lyra Vane stood silently before a holographic personnel report displaying one single classified line highlighted in pale blue text. Homeworld, Earth. Gravity classification, extreme Deathworld. For the first time that night, the alien commander no longer looked amused. Vehicle Bay 3 sat beneath the western side of Coalition Stadium 7 like a buried industrial city made entirely of steel, heat, and noise. Massive armored gravity tanks rested in endless rows beneath towering maintenance cranes, while yellow warning lights rotated slowly through drifting steam high above the bay floor. Hydraulic systems groaned constantly somewhere inside the shadows. The entire chamber smelled like overheated engines and reactor coolant thick enough to taste in the air. Mason Hale stepped out of the maintenance lift carrying his old metal toolbox while tired station workers rushed around him beneath flashing emergency indicators. Nobody looked calm, which usually meant the problem was expensive. A young Coalition technician nearly collided with Mason while running across the maintenance deck, holding a cracked data pad against his chest. Reactor stabilization failure inside Tank 17, the technician blurted nervously. Pressure regulators are drifting outside safety range. Mason glanced toward the far end of the vehicle bay, where several armored officers stood around one enormous gravity tank beneath emergency lighting. Drifting how? Upward. Mason stopped walking. That is bad. Yes. The technician answered quickly. That is why everyone is panicking. Mason sighed softly and continued toward the damaged vehicle. Tank 17 looked even larger up close. Nearly 40 feet long with reinforced gravity plating thick enough to survive orbital combat conditions. Emergency coolant vapor hissed steadily from vents along the machine's lower reactor housing while warning lights flashed crimson across the black armored surface. Several alien engineers argued loudly beside the exposed stabilization core. The pressure valve is failing because of coolant contamination, one insisted. No, another snapped back. The gravity compensator itself is unstable. Mason quietly set his toolbox down beside the tank without interrupting either of them. Then he crouched near the lower reactor housing and placed one rough hand against the vibrating steel. His face tightened slightly. "Turn the compensator off," he said calmly. Both engineers stared at him. "Absolutely not," the first engineer answered immediately. "This is coalition military equipment." Mason nodded slowly. "Then your reactor is going to overload in about." He paused briefly while listening to the vibration pattern moving through the steel plating beneath his hand. 6 minutes. Silence followed instantly. One engineer folded all 4 arms across his uniform chest plate. "Humans are civilian labor species. You are not qualified to diagnose military reactor systems." Mason looked genuinely too tired to argue. "Okay." He stood up, grabbed his toolbox again, and started walking away from the tank. Exactly 3 seconds later, the entire vehicle bay shook beneath a violent metallic boom echoing from inside Tank 17. Every warning light instantly shifted from yellow to deep crimson. Emergency sirens exploded across the chamber loud enough to rattle overhead support beams. Coolant vapor burst from the lower reactor housing in thick white clouds while nearby engineers jumped backward in shock. Mason slowly stopped walking. 5 minutes now, he muttered quietly. The alien engineers stared toward him in stunned silence. High above the maintenance floor, hidden behind the dark observation windows overlooking Vehicle Bay 3, Commander Lyra Vane watched everything. Pale blue holographic data floated silently around her, while security footage replayed Mason predicting the ammunition stabilizer failure earlier that night. Another report hovered beside it displaying Earth environmental statistics. Gravity level, 1.0 standard compression. Atmospheric density, extreme. Evolutionary stress rating, severe. Lyra studied the human mechanic below through the observation glass, while emergency lights flashed across the enormous chamber beneath her. "Interesting," she whispered softly. Down below, Tank 17 released another violent pressure pulse strong enough to shake loose dust from the ceiling framework. Several cadets backed away instinctively. Mason did not. He simply opened his toolbox and pulled out an old steel wrench with chipped blue paint worn nearly smooth from years of use. One nervous technician pointed toward the reactor housing. If the gravity core destabilizes completely, the tank could collapse inward. Mason walked calmly toward the exposed reactor assembly. "Then we should probably stop that from happening. You still think you can repair it?" Mason glanced toward the tank while steam rolled slowly across the maintenance floor around his boots. "Buddy," he answered quietly, "machines break. That is basically their favorite hobby." Another deep metallic groan rolled through the chamber. This time, even the floor beneath the workers vibrated noticeably. Up inside the observation deck, Commander Lyra Vane no longer looked amused by the human mechanic at all. The emergency sirens never stopped after that. Their sharp metallic howl echoed endlessly through Vehicle Bay 3, while workers rushed between armored tanks beneath spinning crimson warning lights. Thick coolant vapor drifted across the steel floor in rolling white clouds, swallowing entire maintenance crews for seconds at a time before revealing them again beneath the harsh industrial lighting. Tank 17 sounded worse now. Every few moments, another deep mechanical groan rolled outward from inside the reactor, housing like the machine itself was struggling to hold its own weight together. Mason Hale knelt beside the exposed gravity core with one sleeve rolled above his elbow while old tools lay scattered around him across the steel plating. Sweat glistened along his forehead despite the cold station air. His rough hands moved carefully through the reactor assembly, while alien engineers stood several feet away, watching him with growing unease. Nobody interrupted anymore. The human had predicted every system failure so far. Pressure output is climbing again. One technician warned nervously while staring at a holographic monitor shaking with unstable readings. Mason tightened another valve without looking up. Because your secondary compensator is fighting the primary field. That is impossible. Coalition systems synchronize automatically. Mason finally glanced toward the technician. Machines lie all the time. Another violent tremor suddenly shook the entire maintenance bay hard enough to rattle overhead crane systems. Several cadets stumbled backward while sparks burst from a nearby control panel in a shower of orange light. Emergency bulkhead doors began sliding partially shut farther down the corridor network. Somewhere in the distance, frightened voices shouted over the alarms. Mason slowly stood from beside the reactor assembly. "Okay," he muttered quietly. "Now it is getting interesting." Above the vehicle bay, Commander Lyra Vane remained motionless behind the dark observation glass, while pale holographic data reflected across her glowing blue eyes. Earth gravity reports continued hovering silently beside military footage of the human mechanic below. One line remained highlighted repeatedly by the Coalition intelligence system. Human musculoskeletal density, abnormally high under standard galactic conditions. Lyra studied Mason carefully as he walked around the unstable gravity tank beneath flashing emergency lights. His posture looked tired. Not afraid. That unsettled her more than panic would have. A senior Coalition engineer stepped beside her observation platform. "Commander, the gravity core should be evacuated immediately. And the cadets inside the lower training compartment?" The engineer hesitated. "Recovery teams may not arrive before containment failure." Lyra looked back toward the reactor chamber below. Through drifting coolant vapor, she could still see the human mechanic quietly checking pressure seals with an old steel wrench, while everyone else prepared evacuation routes. "Interesting species," she whispered softly. Down below, Mason climbed onto the side maintenance rail beside Tank 17, while several engineers argued near the emergency exits. One officer shouted toward him through the alarm noise. "Human, evacuate immediately." Mason leaned sideways listening to the vibration pattern inside the reactor housing. "In a minute. The gravity field is becoming unstable." "Yeah," Mason answered calmly. "I noticed." Another tremor slammed through the bay without warning. This time the entire gravity tank shifted sideways several inches across the steel floor with a horrible grinding sound. Warning lights instantly darkened from crimson to deep black emergency mode. The overhead gravity stabilizers flickered violently. Then suddenly half the maintenance bay became heavier. Workers collapsed against railings. Loose tools crashed hard against the floor. One alien cadet cried out after losing balance beside the reactor trench. Mason immediately grabbed the nearest support rail as the artificial gravity surged upward across the chamber. His boots slammed heavily against the steel deck. Even breathing looked harder now. A terrified technician stared at the gravity monitor. Pressure just doubled. Several alien workers struggled to even remain standing beneath the crushing force now pressing across the maintenance floor. One engineer dropped fully to both knees beside a control station. But Mason still moved. Slowly. Carefully. Like a man carrying invisible weight through deep water. Commander Lyra stepped forward against the observation glass for the first time all night. Her pale blue eyes widened slightly as she watched the human mechanic continue walking toward the unstable gravity tank while trained Coalition personnel collapsed around him. Mason reached the exposed reactor housing, exhaled once through clenched teeth, then quietly placed one rough hand against the shaking steel. "Come on," he muttered softly toward the machine itself. "Do not make me work overtime tonight." The gravity surge kept rising. Every warning monitor across Vehicle Bay 3 flashed unstable crimson numbers while emergency sirens echoed endlessly through the massive chamber. Loose tools rattled violently across steel flooring beneath the crushing pressure. Several alien technicians remained collapsed beside maintenance consoles, struggling just to breathe beneath the intensified gravity field now spreading outward from Tank 17. Coolant vapor rolled through the bay floor like fog beneath red emergency lighting. Mason Hale stayed beside the exposed reactor housing with one rough hand pressed against the vibrating steel while sweat dripped steadily from his forehead onto the metal beneath him. Even standing looked painful now. His heavy work boots groaned against the floor plating each time he shifted his weight. But he still moved. Slowly. Carefully. Like exhaustion had become something familiar years ago. Above the chamber, Commander Lyra Vane watched silently through the observation glass, while pale holographic readings flickered around her. Coalition gravity resistance charts scrolled rapidly beside human biological reports. None of them matched what she was seeing below. Most alien species required powered support harnesses under gravity conditions now flooding the maintenance bay. The human mechanic was still walking. Another violent tremor suddenly slammed through Tank 17 hard enough to shake overhead crane systems loose from their stabilizers. A deep metallic crack echoed across the chamber. Then the impossible happened. The front support braces beneath the gravity tank collapsed entirely. Thousands of pounds of armored plating shifted sideways with a horrifying grinding roar as the massive machine tilted toward the lower maintenance trench where several cadets and engineers were still trapped beneath damaged control rails. Panic exploded instantly. Workers screamed evacuation orders across the bay while emergency lights darkened to full containment mode. One cadet tried pulling another injured technician toward safety, but the gravity pressure forced both of them back against the floor before they could escape. The armored tank continued sliding downward inch by inch toward the trench. "Move," someone shouted desperately. Everybody moved. But nobody could reach the trapped workers in time. Mason looked toward the collapsing vehicle, then toward the trapped cadets beneath it. He exhaled slowly once through clenched teeth. Come on," he muttered tiredly. He dropped his old steel wrench beside the reactor housing and started walking toward the falling gravity tank. Every step looked heavier now beneath the unstable field crushing the chamber. Metal groaned beneath his boots. Nearby alien officers stared at him in disbelief while struggling to even remain upright themselves. One engineer shouted toward him through the alarms. "Human, stop. The weight will kill you." Mason kept moving anyway. "Probably," he answered calmly. The gravity tank slammed harder against the broken support rails with another violent metallic crash. Several trapped cadets cried out beneath the wreckage as sparks burst across the trench in showers of orange light. Then Mason finally reached the side of the collapsing machine. Up close, the armored vehicle looked enormous beneath the flashing emergency lights. Nearly 60 tons of reinforced military steel under unstable gravity amplification. The human mechanic placed both rough hands against the tilted armor plating. For one brief second, the entire chamber seemed to freeze. Commander Lyra stepped forward against the observation glass above the bay, her glowing pale blue eyes widening slightly for the first time all night. Every coalition soldier watched in silence. Mason lowered his head slightly against the steel. Muscles tightened beneath his worn maintenance jacket. His boots slid several inches backward against the floor from the pressure. Then slowly, impossibly, the collapsing gravity tank stopped moving. The entire maintenance bay fell silent except for the screaming emergency sirens overhead. Mason strained visibly now. His arms trembled violently beneath the crushing force, while veins tightened along his neck from the effort. But inch by inch, the enormous armored machine began lifting upward away from the trapped cadets beneath it. Shock spread across every face in the chamber. Alien officers stared frozen in place. One technician dropped his datapad entirely. Commander Lyra could barely breathe. The human mechanic was lifting the tank. Not quickly. Not dramatically. Just enough. Enough for the trapped cadets to crawl free beneath the opening, while Mason held the impossible weight above them with shaking, exhausted arms. One young cadet looked back toward him in disbelief while scrambling to safety. Mason noticed and strained out a few quiet words through clenched teeth. Less staring, he grunted softly. More running. The entire weight of Tank 17 trembled above Mason Hale's shoulders while emergency sirens screamed through Vehicle Bay 3 like mechanical animals trapped inside the walls. Red containment lights flashed endlessly across the armored machine balanced inches above the trapped maintenance trench. Steam rolled around Mason's heavy work boots while his arms shook violently beneath the impossible pressure pressing down against him. Every breath sounded painful now. Slow. Strained. Like gravity itself was trying to crush the air from his lungs. But the tank stayed lifted. Barely. One by one, the trapped cadets crawled beneath the narrow opening towards safety, while nearby coalition officers stared in complete silence. Nobody moved at first because nobody understood what they were seeing. A human civilian mechanic was physically holding a collapsing gravity tank beneath unstable reactor conditions, while trained alien soldiers struggled just to stand upright nearby. Commander Lyra Vane watched from above the maintenance bay, with pale blue eyes frozen wide in disbelief. Every military assumption she had ever accepted about humanity suddenly felt fragile. Wrong. Another deep metallic groan echoed through the chamber as the unstable gravity field surged again. The armored tank shifted downward several dangerous inches in Mason's shaking grip. Several cadets cried out in panic beneath the vehicle. Mason tightened his jaw hard enough for pain to show across his exhausted face. "Come on," he strained quietly. "Move." The last trapped technician stumbled free from beneath the tank just as one of the damaged support braces finally snapped apart with a loud cracking boom. Sparks exploded across the trench. Mason immediately shoved the entire front section of the gravity tank sideways with the last of his strength. The enormous machine slammed violently against a reinforced maintenance barrier instead of collapsing directly downward into the trench below. The impact shook the entire bay hard enough to rattle overhead crane systems. Then suddenly the pressure was gone. Mason staggered backward 3 uneven steps before collapsing hard onto one knee against the steel floor. His breathing sounded rough now beneath the fading sirens. Sweat dripped steadily from his face onto the metal plating below him, while both hands trembled from exhaustion. Around him, the entire maintenance bay remained completely silent. Hundreds of alien personnel simply stared. One young cadet looked toward the human mechanic with visible shock still frozen across his face. "That was impossible," he whispered quietly. Mason wiped sweat from his forehead using the sleeve of his old maintenance jacket. "Yeah," he answered between breaths. It really felt impossible. A few nearby technicians rushed toward the stabilized reactor systems, while emergency crews escorted the rescued cadets away from the damaged trench. But Commander Lyra Vane moved first. The alien commander descended from the observation platform and crossed the maintenance bay floor through drifting coolant vapor without speaking to anyone around her. Her dark military uniform reflected the flashing emergency lights, while nearby officers instinctively stepped aside to let her pass. Mason remained seated against the steel floor beside his dropped toolbox, still trying to steady his breathing beneath the lingering gravity pressure inside the chamber. He looked up only after blue armored boots stopped directly in front of him. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. Lyra studied the exhausted human carefully now from only a few feet away. His face looked older up close beneath the harsh emergency lighting. Tired lines around the eyes. Grease stains across rough hands. Small scars along his forearms from years of industrial labor. Nothing about him looked powerful, which somehow made everything worse. "Why?" she finally asked quietly. Mason blinked once. "Why what? Why risk yourself for soldiers who mocked you only hours ago?" Somewhere nearby, emergency alarms finally began quieting down as stabilization teams regained partial control over the gravity systems. The chamber suddenly felt calmer now. Heavier somehow. Mason looked toward the rescued cadets sitting safely near the far maintenance wall while medics checked them for injuries beneath soft white recovery lights. Then he shrugged weakly. "Because getting crushed still hurts," he answered simply. Commander Lyra Vane stared at him in silence. No speech. No pride. No anger. Just a tired human mechanic speaking like kindness required no explanation at all. Somewhere deep inside the enormous military station, something in the alien commander quietly changed forever. Vehicle Bay 3 felt strangely quiet after the emergency ended. The reactor alarms had finally stopped screaming, replaced instead by the softer sounds of recovery crews moving through drifting coolant vapor beneath dimmed maintenance lights. Engineers inspected damaged support rails while repair drones floated slowly across the chamber, carrying replacement gravity stabilizers through the haze. The massive armored tank still rested sideways against the reinforced maintenance barrier where Mason Hale had pushed it moments earlier. Burn marks and fractured steel covered the surrounding floor, plating like scars left behind by the station itself. Mason sat alone near the edge of the maintenance trench with his back against a cold steel support column while station medics worked nearby. He refused the portable Grav-Assist harness twice before one exhausted technician finally gave up arguing with him. You should at least let medical examine your spinal compression levels, the technician insisted nervously. Mason slowly rotated one sore shoulder beneath his worn maintenance jacket. If my spine still works tomorrow, we are probably good. That is not how medicine works. Honestly, Mason answered tiredly. That explains a lot about hospital bills on Earth. The technician looked confused for several seconds before quietly walking away. Nearby cadets continued stealing nervous glances toward the human mechanic while pretending not to stare directly at him. Nobody laughed anymore. Some looked unsettled. Others looked embarrassed. Most simply looked confused by the idea that the quiet maintenance worker they mocked earlier could survive gravity conditions severe enough to disable trained coalition soldiers. Mason noticed the staring eventually and sighed softly toward his old metal toolbox resting beside him. I miss when people ignored me. Footsteps approached through the drifting steam behind him. Slow. Deliberate. Mason looked up to see Commander Lyra Vane walking across the damaged maintenance floor beneath pale recovery lights. Without the stadium crowd surrounding her, she looked different somehow. Less untouchable. The glowing markings beneath her blue skin reflected softly across the steel walls around them, while nearby officers instinctively stepped aside to clear her path. She stopped beside Mason for several seconds before speaking. Your species classification files are incomplete. Mason leaned his head back gently against the support column behind him. That sounds like paperwork. Your homeworld gravity exceeds coalition military training standards by nearly 40%. Earth likes making things difficult. Lyra studied him carefully. And yet humans are categorized as low-threat labor species. Mason gave a weak shrug. Most humans are just trying to pay rent. For the first time since meeting him, Commander Lyra Vane almost smiled. Almost. The expression disappeared before fully forming across her face. Around them, maintenance workers continued clearing debris beneath flickering white lights while emergency drones scanned damaged reactor systems overhead. Somewhere far above the bay, heavy transport engines hummed through the station walls like distant thunder. Lyra finally looked toward the damaged gravity tank resting against the containment barrier nearby. You could have died. Mason followed her gaze toward the massive armored machine. Yeah, and yet you still chose to help them. Well, he answered quietly, they were trapped. Lyra remained silent for several moments after that. The simplicity of his answer unsettled her more than any military report she had ever read about humanity. No pride. No demand for recognition. No anger toward the cadets who mocked him publicly earlier that night. Just simple concern for strangers beneath falling steel. One young cadet finally approached them hesitantly from across the maintenance bay. His armor still carried dust and coolant stains from the collapse. He stopped several feet from Mason before lowering his head awkwardly. Human, he paused uncomfortably. Thank you. Mason looked genuinely surprised by the apology. Then he nodded once. You are welcome, kid. The cadet hesitated again before quietly placing something beside Mason's toolbox. A coalition military challenge coin marked with the insignia of the Fifth Fleet. One of the highest honors cadets could carry during training rotations. Then the young alien walked away without another word. Mason stared down at the coin resting against his scratched toolbox for several seconds. Huh, he muttered softly. That is new. Commander Lyra Vane watched the exhausted human mechanic carefully beneath the pale maintenance lights while steam drifted slowly through the damaged bay around them. For the first time in her military career, The alien commander realized something deeply unsettling about humanity. Their greatest strength was not physical. It was that they carried impossible weight without needing anyone to notice. The station entered artificial night cycle 6 hours later. Most of Coalition Stadium 7 had gone quiet beneath dimmed corridor lighting and reduced gravity settings, while maintenance crews continued repairs deep inside Vehicle Bay 3. The emergency damage was finally under control. Reactor pressure had stabilized. The destroyed support rails were already being replaced by automated construction drones moving silently through the industrial shadows. But rumors traveled faster than repair crews inside military stations. By midnight, nearly every cadet aboard the Coalition complex had heard the same impossible story. A human civilian lifted a collapsing gravity tank under unstable reactor conditions and saved trapped soldiers while trained officers could barely stand. Most did not believe it until they saw the security footage themselves. Mason Hale did not know any of that. He sat alone inside a small maintenance break room near the lower reactor corridors with a paper cup of terrible station coffee resting beside his toolbox. The room smelled faintly like overheated wiring and old industrial cleaning chemicals. One ceiling light flickered every few seconds above him, while an ancient air circulation fan rattled softly somewhere overhead. Mason looked exhausted now that the adrenaline had faded away. His shoulders remained stiff from the gravity strain, and both hands still trembled slightly whenever he reached for the coffee cup. He stared quietly at the Coalition Challenge coin resting beside his toolbox under the pale overhead light. "Weird night," he muttered softly. The break room door slid open with a low mechanical hiss. Commander Lyra Vane stepped inside carrying no escort officers for the first time since Mason met her. Without the military crowd surrounding her, the alien commander looked strangely calm beneath the soft industrial lighting. The glowing blue markings beneath her skin appeared dimmer now, almost gentle against the cold steel walls around them. Mason glanced up briefly from the coffee cup. "You here to insult humanity again, or was that a one-time event?" To his surprise, Lyra lowered her eyes slightly. "I believe I misjudged your species." Mason nodded once. "Yeah. Humans do that too sometimes." She studied him carefully across the small break room. "Your medical report says you suffered severe muscular compression across both arms and shoulders. Medical reports are dramatic. The report also says your body should not have tolerated the gravity spike levels inside Vehicle Bay 3. Mason took another slow sip of coffee. "Honestly, my lower back agrees with the report." For the first time, Lyra actually smiled. Small. Brief. But real. The expression disappeared almost immediately afterward, though something softer remained behind her glowing pale blue eyes now. She stepped closer to the maintenance table and looked down at the old Earth Shipping Company patch sewn into Mason's worn jacket sleeve. "Why do humans hide their strength?" Mason frowned slightly. "What do you mean? Your species is classified across Coalition databases as physically average. Weak compared to military species." Mason shrugged gently. "Most humans are not trying to impress anybody. But you carried impossible weight tonight." He stared quietly into the steam rising from his paper coffee cup for several seconds before answering. "Where I come from, people carry heavy things every day." Lyra remained silent. Mason finally looked up toward her again. "Single parents. Factory workers. Nurses. Construction crews. Farmers. People working 2 jobs, trying to survive. His tired eyes reflected softly beneath the pale break room lighting. Humans get pretty good at carrying weight. The alien commander slowly lowered herself into the empty chair across from him without breaking eye contact. Somewhere outside the small maintenance room, distant machinery hummed through the station walls while repair drones moved along the lower corridors. Quiet industrial sounds. The kind most people stop noticing. On my world, Lyra said softly, strength exists to establish dominance. Mason gave a tired half-smile. That sounds exhausting. She tilted her head slightly. Then what is strength for on Earth? Mason looked down at his rough hands resting beside the old toolbox on the table. Hands covered in scars, grease stains, and years of difficult labor nobody would ever celebrate publicly. Then he answered quietly. Mostly protecting people who cannot carry it alone. Silence filled the break room after that. Not uncomfortable silence. Heavy silence. The kind that changes something permanent between 2 people. Commander Lyra Vane looked at the exhausted human mechanic sitting across from her beneath the flickering maintenance light and realized the Coalition had misunderstood humanity completely. Humans were not dangerous because they were strong. Humans were dangerous because they could suffer without becoming cruel. 3 days later, Coalition Stadium 7 reopened under full operational status. The emergency damage inside Vehicle Bay 3 had been repaired almost completely. New support rails lined the maintenance trench where the gravity tank collapsed while polished reactor housings reflected clean white industrial lighting across the restored chamber. Fresh cadets moved through the station corridors again beneath military banners and holographic training schedules like nothing extraordinary had happened there at all. But the atmosphere felt different now. Quieter somehow. More careful. Rumors had become stories. Stories had become recorded security footage passed between military fleets across Coalition space. The human mechanic who lifted a gravity tank under collapsing reactor pressure no longer sounded like a joke when soldiers whispered about him in training halls. Mason Hale noticed none of this at first. He walked through the lower station corridors carrying his old metal toolbox beneath one arm, while holding a paper coffee cup in the other hand exactly the same way he had every morning for years. His gray maintenance jacket still carried grease stains along one sleeve. His shoulders still looked tired. He still moved like a man already thinking about unfinished repair orders before breakfast. The only difference was what happened when alien soldiers saw him now. They moved aside. Quietly. Respectfully. No laughter followed him through the corridors anymore. No mocking comments about weak humans. Even the younger cadets lowered their eyes slightly as he passed. Mason slowed briefly near one hallway intersection after noticing an entire group of Coalition trainees standing silently against the corridor wall waiting for him to pass first. He blinked once in confusion. Okay, he muttered softly to himself. That is definitely new. Far above the maintenance sectors, Commander Lyra Vane stood inside the massive observation deck overlooking Coalition Stadium 7 while morning station light reflected softly across the stars beyond the transparent alloy windows. A military officer approached her carrying updated personnel reports. Commander, the officer said carefully, the Coalition Senate has formally requested the human mechanics transfer for evaluation. Lyra did not look away from the station below. Denied. The officer hesitated. Commander, he is maintenance personnel, Lyra answered calmly. Not a laboratory specimen. The officer lowered his head slightly and stepped backward without another word. Below the observation deck, Mason entered one of the lower maintenance lifts while quietly sipping terrible station coffee. The lift doors nearly closed before another hand stopped them from sealing shut. Commander Lyra stepped inside beside him. For several seconds, neither of them spoke while the maintenance lift descended slowly through layers of industrial station corridors. The soft mechanical hum of the lift echoed gently around them. Mason glanced sideways toward her eventually. "You know," he said quietly, "most military commanders do not spend this much time in maintenance sectors." "Most military commanders," Lyra answered softly, "have never met humans before." Mason smiled tiredly into his coffee cup. The lift continued descending in silence until finally Lyra spoke again. "The Senate wishes to study your species more closely now." Mason sighed immediately. "That sounds exhausting. I refuse the request." He looked genuinely surprised by that. "Why?" Lyra studied the tired human beside her beneath the pale maintenance lighting. "Because strength without cruelty should not be punished." Silence returned after that. Heavy silence. Honest silence. Somewhere deep below the station, machinery vibrated softly through the lift walls while repair crews began another ordinary work cycle. Mason finally looked down at his scarred, rough hands wrapped around the old paper coffee cup. "Humans are not really special," he said quietly. "Most people back home would have done the same thing." Lyra looked toward him carefully. "That," she answered softly, "is exactly what makes humanity frightening." The maintenance lift doors finally opened onto the lower engineering decks. Warm industrial air rolled through the corridor, carrying the familiar smell of coolant systems, steel, and engine grease. Mason adjusted the toolbox beneath his arm and started walking toward another long day of repair work beneath the endless station machinery. Before the doors closed again behind him, Commander Lyra Vane spoke one final time. "Mason." He looked back. The alien commander slowly placed one hand against the center of her chest in the oldest military gesture of honor inside Coalition history. Not for a warrior. Not for a conqueror. For a tired human mechanic carrying an old toolbox through a cold steel corridor. Mason stared awkwardly for a second before giving a small, uncertain wave with his coffee cup. Then the lift doors closed between them. Outside the massive observation windows of Coalition Stadium 7, endless stars drifted silently across the darkness of space. And somewhere within that enormous galaxy, humanity no longer looked weak.